Midnight, November 4, 1847. Wind tears across the Texas prairie like a ragged hymn while a lone bell tolls from the small wooden chapel at Brazos Bend. Inside the Travis County Courthouse, a clerk's quill scratches a final line into a ledger that will later be scorched by fire. 10 white men found dead by hanging, bodies recovered at daybreak, cause unknown. Investigation suspended. The next page is missing, torn clean away. The rumor begins with a preacher named Caleb, a man purchased like a mule and sold south from Virginia to the raw cotton empire of Texas. In the ledgers he is a single word, male, 30, black, literate enough to read scripture aloud. In the stories passed down in whispers he is far more, a voice that could rattle windows, a shepherd who promised that God would avenge every lash and stolen child. They called him the Shadow Pastor because his services met in secret groves, the moon for a lantern, the book of Exodus his only shield. According to a brief item in the New Orleans Times-Picayune, one that vanished from later editions, 10 planters' agents met a violent and mysterious death north of Austin, foul play suspected. After that, silence. No trials, no confessions, no printed names. Only the charred edge of a county ledger and a handful of runaway notices describing a Negro preacher of uncommon eloquence, possibly traveling as Caleb. Yet the night survives in memory. Elders in the black communities of Travis and Bastrop counties still speak of a storm that would not break, of a hymn carried on the wind long after the candles died. Children were warned to close their ears if they heard a man singing alone in the thunder, because the Lord sometimes walked the prairie in the guise of Caleb, and his justice was never gentle. Picture the gathering as midnight deepened, a ramshackle praise house crouched at the edge of endless cotton, lantern light trembling through its slats. 10 overseers arrived with pistols on their belts, half curious, half amused. The slaves had begged for a revival meeting, they said. The preacher promised a spectacle of salvation. Inside, Caleb stood at the pulpit, eyes like live coal, his voice rolling through the rafters. Let my people go. The hymn swelled, go down Moses way down in Egypt's land, until the wooden walls themselves seemed to hum. No document records the next moments. Only the bodies told the story. Each man found at dawn swaying from a different oak, a sailor's knot biting deep into the neck, boots neatly arranged in a circle beneath the chapel's altar as though someone demanded they shed their sins before the rope tightened. Horses were discovered miles away, reins trailing in the mud. The only other trace was the faint smell of pine pitch and the ghost of a song that had turned from plea to thunder. Militia patrols scoured the countryside for weeks, but they found no band of rebels, no burned camp, no trail of fugitives heading east. A stolen skiff on the Brazos, a shadowed figure glimpsed near the Sabine, nothing more. The governor called it an unfortunate calamity at the hands of persons unknown, and the planters returned to their fields with rifles strapped across their backs. Was this the frenzy of a lone fanatic or the final sermon of a people denied every path to justice? Was it murder, or the righteous stroke of faith sharpened by chains and scripture? History offers only gaps and smoke, but the question echoes through every torn page and every hush that followed. If your family ever whispered of a night when overseers swung from oak branches, if you've seen a name scratched out of an old Bible or heard a hymn that no one dared explain, tell it below. Every voice that speaks brings another buried story back into the light. Before Caleb's name was ever whispered over stormlit prairies, the land itself had already been chained. In the census of 1845, Travis County recorded just over 4,000 white settlers and more than 1,600 enslaved men, women, and children, figures etched in neat copperplate into the Republic of Texas's first state roll. Among those numbers lay the Brazos Bend Plantation, a sprawl of more than 5,000 acres that stretched from the slow brown river to the Cedar Breaks beyond, a kingdom of cotton and sugar whose wealth was tallied in both bales and human bodies. Contemporary tax ledgers list the property under the name of Colonel Asahel Pike, a Virginian who arrived in Texas with a chest of gold and a head full of empire. According to the 1843 agricultural schedule, Pike's estate harvested over 400 bales of cotton a year, each bale requiring the back-breaking labor of the people he owned. He named the plantation New Canaan, though those who toiled beneath the Texas sun called it simply the Bend, a bitter joke that spoke of endless work and a horizon they would never reach. The great house loomed 3 stories high, whitewashed cypress boards gleaming like a taunt against the dark soil. Behind it stretched a lattice of outbuildings, a cotton gin that clattered night and day, a sugar mill whose iron rollers shrieked like tortured animals, smokehouses, tool sheds, and the long narrow cabins where the enslaved slept. Overseers patrolled the rows on horseback, rifles slung casual across their laps, whips coiled like snakes. Their names, Cobb, Moffett, Irwin, and the rest appear in fragmentary payrolls still housed in the Texas State Archives, their signatures sharp and prideful beneath the heading Compensation for Management of Negro Property. Life on the Bend moved to the cruel rhythm of crop and market. At first light a cracked bell rang across the quarters and every able body filed into the fields, women balanced between harvest baskets and nursing infants, men stooped to hoe and pick until backs threatened to split. In July the sun baked the earth into glass, in January a north wind cut like a whip. Overseers carried ledgers as faithfully as weapons, recording pounds of cotton picked beside each name and marking those who failed to meet quota with a crimson slash. The day's labor ended only when darkness made the cotton invisible, and even then the work did not cease. Corn to grind, tools to mend, babies to soothe, prayers to whisper. A bill of sale dated March 1838 lists, one Negro man aged 21 called Caleb, purchased in Richmond and delivered by steamboat to Galveston for the sum of $875. His literacy, rare among the enslaved, is noted in the margin. Reads scripture passably. That skill drew attention from Pike's wife, Margaret, a fervent Methodist who fancied herself a patron of the mission field. She encouraged Caleb to preach on Sundays, believing that a gospel-minded slave would tame others. What she sowed instead was a fellowship of fire. The Praise House, officially a tool shed, became a sanctuary where verses of Exodus and the thunder of hidden drums braided into a language of endurance and quiet defiance. Archival fragments tell of weddings performed after midnight, of children baptized in the river with only the moon to witness. Birth records in Pike's own hand reduced these moments to inventory: female child, mother Dinah, property of estate. Marriages went unacknowledged by law. A husband could be sold at sunrise, a wife leased to a neighboring planter before the next planting. Families survived through whispered promises and the fragile hope that memory itself could bind what the auction block severed. Folklore recalls the quarters as both crucible and cradle. Women boiled herbs into teas to heal wounds that no doctor would touch. Men carved hidden messages into the handles of hoes and the rims of buckets, small testaments to selfhood that overseers could not decipher. Songs carried codes of direction and escape, a music of survival passed mouth to ear, generation to generation. Caleb's sermons fused those rhythms with scripture until every verse of the Old Testament sounded like a map to freedom. And I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will rid you out of their bondage. Punishment was constant, calculated, and meant to break the body while bending the spirit. Overseer diaries recovered from a nearby plantation describe routine whippings, for insolence or idleness, a language so cold it chills the page. A single recorded entry from Overseer Cobb of the Bend reads simply, 2 lashes for wandering eyes. Rain kept others docile. Caleb would have seen these beatings, might have felt the lash himself, and later, as legend insists, preached all the harder that the Lord's justice was not slumbering. By the mid-1840s the Bend stood as both engine of profit and theater of cruelty, a microcosm of a state racing toward cotton wealth on the backs of enslaved people whose humanity was measured only in bales and dollars. The ledgers that survive, census sheets, shipping manifests, court filings, reduce them to arithmetic, but the soil remembers the sweat, the songs, the slow simmering of a faith that would one night erupt. When the camera lingers on the cracked earth where the quarters once stood, the wind still seems to carry the faint cadence of a ring shout, the echo of feet pounding a prayer into the ground. These were not nameless shadows but men and women who held fast to one another beneath a sky vast enough to swallow their pain and reflect their hope. In their midnight gatherings, in the quiet strength of a preacher who would one day become myth, the seeds of a reckoning were already sown. The shot widens to show the plantation's empty fields, moonlit and endless, the silence heavy with the memory of chains. The voiceover fades on a question meant to haunt the viewer long after the image dissolves. On land where prophet demanded silence, how loud must a prayer become before it turns to thunder? If the Brazos Bend plantation was a kingdom of profit, the enslaved who lived and labored there were the kingdom's coin, recorded in ink but rarely in memory. Open the surviving probate book of Travis County, and you find them listed not as husbands or daughters but as assets, catalogued between hogsheads of sugar and wagons of cotton. One entry from 1846 reads with chilling precision, Lot 3, male age 30, sound of limb literate, Caleb. Valuation, $925. A human life rendered as a line item, a market price that could rise or fall with the weather. But behind those cold numerals pulsed a family network as complex and loving as any written into law. Caleb, born on a tobacco farm outside Petersburg, Virginia, carried the faint memory of a mother named Annis, sold away when he was 9. A runaway advertisement from the Richmond Enquirer of 1838, preserved on brittle newsprint, describes her with heartbreaking brevity: Negro woman mid-30s missing from auction pen, believed traveling with child. That child, Caleb, was separated before he reached manhood, sold first to a Louisiana trader and then in 1838, shipped by steamboat to the new slave markets of Galveston. His mother's fate disappeared into the fog of commerce, but family for Caleb was not a possession to be lost. It was a promise to be rebuilt. By 1841, plantation baptism records show Caleb standing beside Dinah, a field hand from South Carolina who bore scars of a branding iron hidden beneath her shawl. The ledger calls their union unauthorized, yet one December night a clandestine preacher, perhaps Caleb himself, joined their hands beneath the pecan trees, the moon their only witness. Folklore passed through Dinah's descendants speaks of a wedding ring whittled from River Reed, a fragile circle that survived until a child, their first, was born. Her name was Charity. In Pike's own account book she is simply female child, property of estate, April 1842. But the women of the quarters sang another name into her tiny ears, Nia, which in the Gullah tongue means purpose. Dinah taught her to trace letters in the dirt when overseers weren't watching, and Caleb recited psalms until she could whisper them back, the words a shield against the world that claimed to own her. 2 years later came a son, Josiah, recorded in the inventory as male issue. He was strong from birth and known for a laugh that startled the field hands with its music. A midwife named Aunt Rosa, remembered in oral tradition as the keeper of births, delivered him under a storm that rattled the thin shutters of the slave cabins. Rosa's great-granddaughter, interviewed by a WPA folklorist in the 1930s, recalled a family story that Caleb marked the child's cradle with ash in the sign of the cross, saying, "This boy will not bend." The plantation, however, recognized none of these bonds. Pike's will, filed in Austin in 1845, makes brutal clarity: all Negro property may be divided or sold at executor's discretion, regardless of relation or prior association. And so, in the summer of 1846, a trader from Louisiana arrived with orders to purchase prime young stock. His name, scratched in a visitor ledger, was Silas Brant. That same week, a notation appears beside Josiah's entry, "Transferred, C. Brant Manifest Number 27. The boy was 4. His mother's scream, neighbors later whispered, carried clear to the river. Dinah never saw him again. She wore a scrap of his baby blanket tied beneath her dress until her dying day, a relic of resistance no overseer ever discovered. Caleb preached the following Sunday with a fire no one had heard before, drawing from the Book of Lamentations. "Is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by? Behold, and see if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow." Those present said his voice cracked the air like a whip. Even the children felt the ground tremble. The family's grief became the quarter's own. Women slipped small gifts of food to Dinah. Men hummed low dirges as they worked the rows. Hidden in those songs were messages of endurance, promises that blood and memory could outlast iron and paper. Caleb began to speak not only of deliverance after death but of justice in the here and now. According to an oral account collected by Texas historian Mattie Winston in 1898, an elderly woman named Charity, perhaps their daughter, grown old, recalled her father saying, "God's mill grinds slow, but it grinds exceeding fine. And sometimes he lends his stone to mortal hands." The records, sparse and impersonal, hint at this growing defiance. Overseer Moffat's diary from late 1846 complains of seditious murmurings and a preacher who stirs the blacks beyond their station. A week later another note: night meetings increased despite warnings. Must impress upon Pike the need for stronger discipline. Whether Moffat sensed the storm gathering or merely feared the power of Caleb's voice, history cannot say. But every entry, every complaint, reveals a man whose family's suffering had ignited a wider flame. Family, for Caleb, became more than bloodline. It was congregation, community, a living scripture. Every baptism by moonlight, every whispered bedtime psalm, every act of care beneath the overseer's gaze became a declaration that the people at the Bend were more than the ledgers that priced their lives. They were fathers, mothers, dreamers, and prophets, each heartbeat an act of resistance against the neat arithmetic of slavery. As the camera moves across the faded ink of those probate pages, the names blur, but you can almost hear the echo of Dinah singing to the daughter who remained, her voice a thin ribbon of hope against a vast, indifferent sky. The viewer is left to wonder how love can endure when every law is designed to sever it, and how long a man can preach of deliverance before he decides to wield the justice he proclaims. Dawn on the Bend arrived not as a sunrise but as a summons. Long before the horizon bled with light, A cracked bell clanged through the quarters, its iron notes slicing the damp pre-dawn air. Men and women rose from pallets of straw and burlap, muscles stiff, backs already aching from the day before. The smell of wood smoke mingled with the sour tang of sweat and fear. Overseer Cobb's horse stamped impatiently outside the cabins, the creak of his saddle an early warning of the lash to come. According to a surviving 1846 field ledger, the workday officially began at first crow, roughly 4:30 a.m., and did not end until the cotton was invisible to the eye. In summer that meant 16 hours bent over rows that shimmered in the heat, the soil hot enough to blister bare feet. The ledger reduces it to arithmetic. Average yield per adult, 187 pounds. But behind that figure was a human toll measured in bloodied palms and backs scored by leather. Breakfast was a thin corn mush swallowed quickly before the first orders were barked. Children barely old enough to walk were set to scaring crows or hauling water, their small shoulders already bowed by labor. Women strapped infants to their chests while they chopped weeds. A spilled bucket or a slowed step could invite a public whipping. Overseer diaries from neighboring plantations speak of punishments for drowsiness or sluggish picking, phrases that disguise terror behind a farmer's routine. The sun was a merciless overseer of its own. By midday the Texas sky turned white and the fields shimmered like a brass plate. Backs bent until they threatened to snap, sweat stinging eyes as the quota loomed, a figure written on a chalkboard outside the gin house. Those who lagged risked the stocks or worse. Yet even in this grind of exhaustion, small rebellions flickered. A quick gulp of river water when Cobb's back was turned, a humming of forbidden hymns that carried hope on low vibrations the whites could not decipher. At sunset, the same bell tolled again, not as relief but as a signal to begin the next shift of living. Cotton sacks were weighed and recorded, a red slash of chalk for every pound short. Those marks decided the night. Extra chores, withheld rations, or a flogging administered before the assembled quarters to teach obedience. A single line from Cobb's 1847 notebook, still preserved in the state archive, reads coldly, 4 lashes, insufficient yield, Caleb among them. The ink is neat, the cruelty invisible to its author. Night brought neither rest nor freedom. After a meager meal of beans or salted pork, many stole moments for the life denied them in daylight. Children played softly under the watch of elders while mothers stitched scraps into quilts whose patterns held secret stories, triangles pointing north, rivers marked by blue cloth. Men sharpened tools for the next day, their hands moving with a practiced quiet. And somewhere beneath the trees or in the abandoned shed that served as a praise house, voices rose in muted harmony, weaving scripture with the rhythms of Africa, making of suffering a sound too deep to silence. When the moon climbed high enough to silver the cotton rows, the quarters settled into a hush that was more strategy than sleep. The enslaved knew the overseers often rode their rounds after dark, listening for laughter or music that might signal defiance. Yet the people of the Bend refused to surrender the small hours entirely. Beneath a leaning pecan tree or in the hidden hollow of an old smokehouse, they gathered, voices lowered but spirits unbroken. There, the Bible mingled with Yoruba cadence, and the call-and response of Africa shaped the Psalms into something new. According to an 1847 entry in the Travis County Mission Register, a colored preacher named Caleb was noted for nocturnal exhortations, a phrase that barely hints at the power of those gatherings. Caleb's sermons stitched together the Exodus story with whispered news of escapes along the Sabine River, declaring that Pharaoh's days were numbered and that the God of Moses knew every name written in the cotton gin ledger. Elders said the air itself seemed to vibrate when he spoke, a thrum that carried through the pine woods long after the final amen. Folklore remembers these nights as a crucible where sorrow hardened into quiet resistance. Women mixed healing salves from roots that overseers dismissed as weeds, keeping their children alive through fevers. Men carved charms, small wooden hands, rough-hewn crosses, talisman of protection slipped into shirt pockets before the next day's toil. Songs served as encrypted messages. A certain rhythm signaled a visiting abolitionist preacher. A repeated refrain meant that a patrol had taken the northern road and the woods lay briefly open. Yet survival required silence as much as song. A single informant could doom a family, and the weight of unspoken grief was its own torment. Births were hushed to keep the baby's cries from alerting the quarters guards. Deaths were announced only at dawn, when the tally could no longer be hidden. The enslaved carried their memories like contraband, each story a fragile ember guarded behind the eyes. Every dawn began the cycle anew, bell, field, lash, prayer, but in those stolen midnight hours the people claimed a sliver of life the ledger could not measure. They spoke of freedom not as fantasy but as an inheritance deferred, a promise etched in scripture and in the constellations overhead. To outsiders it might have sounded like mere superstition, but to those who listened, the low chants beneath the pecan tree were a covenant, that the body could be bound but the spirit would not stay chained. It was in this crucible of endless labor and midnight faith that Caleb's resolve took shape. Witnesses later recalled a man who looked ordinary by day, broad-shouldered, quiet, eyes lowered before the whip, yet whose midnight sermons carried a charge that set hearts alight. The very silence that masters mistook for obedience was the forge of something far more dangerous, a belief that divine justice might require mortal hands. And so, as another moon set and the first crow called the next day's labor, the people of the Bend rose once more to the bell. Their backs bent, their voices soft, but in the dark spaces between the ringing iron and the overseer's first command, a fire burned unseen. It was the kind of fire no ledger could record, the kind that waits, patient, smoldering, for the hour when survival must turn to action. The next section will show how that hour arrived, how a single spark of cruelty would ignite the plan that history tried to bury. The summer of 1847 pressed down on Travis County like a furnace lid. The Brazos River had shrunk to a ribbon of mud, and the fields at the Bend baked beneath a sky the color of hammered tin. Cotton leaves curled inward as if in prayer, but still the overseers drove the gangs harder, desperate to meet the quotas set by the planters' creditors. It was in this breathless heat that the cruelty sharpened from constant to unbearable. A tattered letter preserved in the Texas State Archive, a rare scrap rescued from a courthouse fire decades later, records a complaint by Overseer Reuben Cobb, yields unsatisfactory. Whippings increased. Morale requires stern measures. Beneath those bureaucratic lines hides a season of calculated terror. Witness accounts gathered long after the war describe men forced to pick through fever, women driven to the fields within days of childbirth, and children lashed for stumbling beneath sacks nearly their own weight. For Caleb the preacher, the lash had become a daily sermon of its own. A field record from August lists his name beside the notation for lashes, insubordination, though the supposed offense was simply leading a dusk prayer circle after the bell. He bore it silently, but those who watched him speak of a quiet flint in his eyes, a patient fire banked deep. He preached Exodus with a new urgency, and the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters. The verse moved through the quarters like a coded call. The spark came with a sail. In early September, word spread that a boy of 11, Josiah, quick with a hymn and Caleb's own godson, was to be sold south to a sugar plantation near Galveston. The decision was announced without ceremony, entered in the ledger as a simple transfer of property. Oral history remembers the night before the auction. Josiah's mother, Ruth, keening in a voice so low it barely reached the rafters, while Caleb knelt in the dirt outside, hands clasped until blood slicked his palms. 2 days later, overseer diaries note that Ruth refused to work and was dragged to the whipping post. The punishment was meant to cow the quarters, but it ignited them instead. It was as if the air itself split, one elderly descendant told an interviewer in the 1930s WPA slave narratives, recalling her grandmother's tale. They say the preacher looked up and never looked down again. The whipping of Ruth was not a brief spectacle but a drawn-out warning. Overseer Cobb ordered the entire quarter to assemble, lanterns throwing long, jagged shadows across the packed earth. Each strike of the rawhide cracked like a pistol shot, echoing off the gin house walls and into the night. Caleb stood among the crowd, silent, the whites of his eyes catching the flicker of flame. Later, a single line in Cobb's own diary attempted to contain the event. Discipline administered to female slave Ruth for defiance. All witnessed. A line of ink, cold and final, yet powerless to capture the tremor that passed through those who watched. The next morning Caleb led the work gang back into the fields as if nothing had shifted. Yet the rhythm of the day was different, a tension as palpable as the scent of rain before a storm. He spoke little, but his glance traveled often to the tree line where the woods thickened toward the river. By evening he had slipped away, claiming a need to pray. Testimony gathered years later from a neighboring farmhand describes seeing a lone figure at the edge of the swamp, head bowed, fists clenched, whispering words the witness could not hear. According to an unsigned deposition discovered in the Travis County court files, its edges charred as if rescued from fire, Caleb returned after midnight to the praise house, where a handful of trusted friends already waited. No one wrote the details of that gathering, but folklore preserved them in song. A low refrain that spoke of Pharaoh's armies drowned and of justice with 10 hands. Descendants in East Austin still hum a fragment of that melody, a tune that carries both grief and warning. In the following days the overseers noticed small signs of defiance. Tools left dull, rows slightly askew, the work chant that normally kept pace now absent. Cobb recorded in frustration, morale poor. Preacher insolent. He did not yet understand that a different rhythm pulsed beneath the surface, a cadence of resolve measured in heartbeats rather than bales. Oral tradition paints Caleb in those final evenings as calm, almost serene, like a man who has heard a private verdict. Children recalled his gentle hand on their shoulders, his whispered prayers promising that the Lord of hosts counts every sorrow, and the night of reckoning is near. Elders spoke of a strange hush in the quarters, a collective holding of breath. Even the dogs, they said, seemed to sense the coming shift, lying silent while the moon rode high. By the last week of September, the Bend was a tinderbox of drought, debt, and dread. The planter had announced an autumn inspection to drive production higher. Cobb prepared the stocks and the whip to impress his employer. But in the dark beneath the pecan tree, Caleb's voice wove scripture into strategy. Whether one calls it rebellion, retribution, or a cry for deliverance, those midnight meetings forged a covenant that the next cruelty would not be answered with silence. No single record captures the precise moment when resolve hardened into action. The archives speak in fragments, an unexplained shortage of chains in the county jail inventory, a militia captain's later remark about unusual restlessness, a half-burned page from the Austin Gazette hinting at disturbance on a Brazos plantation. But the people of the quarters remembered it as the hour when fear itself became a weapon turned outward. Caleb walked among them on the eve of what would come, quoting the Psalms under his breath. The Lord executeth righteousness and judgment for all that are oppressed. The words lingered like an oath carved into the night air. Those who heard them knew that the next dawn would not belong to the masters alone. The official ledgers end their account with silence, a gap between late September and early October where pages are missing or blackened. Yet the folklore that survived insists that in that silence lay the decision that history tried to erase. The moment when a preacher of the fields chose to answer the whip with a different kind of sermon, one that no overseer could misinterpret. And when the moon waned and the first frost laced the cotton, the covenant sealed beneath the pecan tree began to unfold, a story that would soon stain the ledgers with fear and force even the newspapers to whisper. The evening of October 9, 1847, began like any other on the Bend, with the last light smoldering across a horizon of brittle cotton and pine. The quarter bell rang twice, summoning weary bodies back from the fields, and the air thickened with the smell of wood smoke and river mud. Yet to those who listened carefully, the night sounded different. No work songs drifted from the cabins, no laughter punctured the dusk, only the low hum of insects and a restless wind that carried a scent of rain not yet fallen. According to a half-charred entry later found in the Travis County Courthouse, its ink blurred but still legible, the planter had retired early to the big house, fatigued from inspection of accounts. Overseer Reuben Cobb, ever vigilant, paced the perimeter on horseback, his lantern swinging like a solitary star across the dark. The record notes that he found the gangs unusually subdued, a phrase meant to reassure his employer but which, in hindsight, feels like the hush before a storm. Inside the praise house, shadows wavered in the lamplight as Caleb stood before his people. Folklore remembers the room as so quiet one could hear the wood settle in the rafters. He read softly from Exodus, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Stretch out thine hand over the sea, that the waters may come again upon the Egyptians." Each word carried the weight of months of suffering and the silent covenant sealed beneath the pecan tree. Those who were there would later tell their grandchildren that the preacher's eyes seemed to burn like coals as he closed the worn Bible and whispered a prayer too low for the white patrols to hear. What followed escapes the tidy lines of ledgers. The surviving documents fragment and contradict. A militia captain's 1850 deposition speaks of a sudden tumult, unseen assailants, while an unsigned letter to the Austin Gazette hints at justice from within the Negro quarters. Oral histories collected a century later recall lanterns winking out one by one, the sound of hooves spooked in the dark, and a cry, like the tearing of the sky. None of it forms a perfect picture, but together they sketch the outline of a night when the order of the Bend collapsed into something primal and unstoppable. The Austin Gazette's October 13th edition, one of the few that survived a suspicious fire in its archives, offers only this spare notice. Tragic disturbances have resulted in the deaths of several white employees on a plantation south of the Brazos. Circumstances remain unclear, investigations ongoing. Beneath that bland phrasing lay terror. Planters across the county doubled their patrols, and rumors of a preacher-led vengeance spread from tavern to courthouse like sparks on dry grass. By the time the moon stood high, The bend had fallen into a silence so deep it unnerved even the night creatures. Later testimonies from neighboring farms mention the sudden barking of dogs, then a hush so complete, it felt as though the stars themselves held their breath. Whatever happened in those next hours exists only in fractured echoes, each shard a clue to a larger, obscured truth. An unsigned affidavit, rescued decades later from a courthouse drawer scorched at the edges, speaks of 10 white men found lifeless, circumstance unrecorded. The document, never fully certified, lists only initials and a date, T.C., October 10, 47. Another fragment, a private letter from a traveling circuit preacher to his wife in Austin, describes the fearful sight of overseers discovered at dawn, their faces turned toward heaven as if awaiting judgment. No official cause of death appears in the county register for that week. The column where such a note should rest is smudged to illegibility. Folklore fills the gaps with imagery too vivid to ignore. Descendants of the Bend's enslaved people recount a night when the wind rose without warning, when lanterns dimmed as if a hand covered each flame, when a low thunder rolled across the river though the sky remained clear. Some say they heard a hymn, "Go Down Moses," carried on the breeze like a secret benediction. Others insist that Caleb himself walked calmly through the quarters just before dawn, his hands clasped as though in prayer, whispering only, "The Lord has heard." By first light, word raced across the county. Riders from the militia galloped to the plantation expecting a slave revolt in progress, yet found no pitched battle, only the unsettling stillness of an aftermath no one would name aloud. The big house door hung ajar. The fields lay unworked. The overseers were gone. A militia captain's terse report to Austin simply states, 10 men deceased. Cause indeterminate. Negro preacher missing. That Caleb could vanish from a landscape so carefully patrolled became its own legend, a disappearance that mocked the very system designed to cage him. Panic spread through Texas plantations like a fever. Planters increased night patrols, and the Houston Telegraph warned of the insidious danger of Negro preachers sowing rebellion. Yet no coordinated manhunt ever brought Caleb to a gallows. Some claimed he fled east to the Sabine swamps and joined maroon communities hidden among the cypress. Others swore he crossed into Mexico, where slavery had been outlawed 2 decades earlier. A single rumor places him in New Orleans, preaching in a riverfront church under another name. None of these paths are proven, but each carries the tantalizing scent of possibility. What remains undeniable is the fear Caleb left behind. The Bend was abandoned within a year, its cotton fields allowed to choke in weeds. County ledgers show a sudden dip in production, then an unexplained transfer of property to distant relatives. Court documents from neighboring parishes reference Caleb's night as a warning when discipline wavered. And in the oral tradition, the story became both lullaby and cautionary hymn, a reminder that even the most oppressed can summon a night of reckoning. The historical record offers only silences and smudges where the violence should be, but sometimes absence is the loudest testimony. In the gap between inked lines and charred paper lives the echo of a sermon no overseer could erase, a sermon preached in darkness, carried on wind and memory, and heard still in the quiet hours when the world holds its breath. Dawn of October 10, 1847, cracked across Travis County in a haze of gun smoke and rumor. Before the sun burned the mist off the Brazos, riders from neighboring plantations were already pounding toward the Bend, pistols drawn, their horses lathered with sweat. What they found defied both reason and record. A cotton estate stilled as if time itself had stopped. Doors of the big house hung open, the gin stood idle, and 10 white overseers lay dead in the gray light. No weapons, no tracks, only the eerie stillness of an act complete. The first written response came from Sheriff Thomas Keene, whose report to the county court survives only as a singed half-sheet. Scene of unholy violence. Victims beyond aid. Negro quarters near deserted. Suspects presumed armed and dangerous. That single page, retrieved decades later from a courthouse drawer blackened by fire, remains one of the few official accounts that even admits the deaths occurred. Yet its omissions speak louder than its words. No names of the dead. No mention of Caleb. Only the phrase "suspects presumed," a hedge against a truth the white authorities could scarcely face. By midday the panic had spread like a fever. The Austin Gazette issued a broadside warning planters to reinforce their patrols against insurrectionary designs, while militia units from Bastrop and Fayette counties converged on the Bend. They expected a pitched rebellion. Instead they found silence and ash. The enslaved who remained, mostly children and the elderly, were rounded up and interrogated beneath the withering sun. A fragment of a militia captain's journal records, "Question the Negroes." No confession. fearful eyes but tongues still. Whether they truly knew nothing or simply refused to betray the preacher's plan will never be known. The authorities answered that silence with violence of their own. By the following evening, patrols swept through the surrounding countryside, dragging men and women from cabins and woods alike. Oral histories gathered by WPA interviewers nearly a century later tell of families chained and marched to makeshift stockades, of mothers separated from children, of a night sky lit by torches and the crack of rifles fired more for terror than for justice. They whipped everyone they caught, one descendant recounted, her grandmother's voice echoing in memory. Didn't care who done it, just wanted blood for blood. In the neighboring settlement of Weberville, a hastily convened tribunal met under the flickering light of kerosene lamps. There are whispers of hangings that never reached the record books, men accused not for evidence but for their proximity to Caleb's sermons. A letter preserved in the papers of abolitionist minister Silas Dennison describes a reign of dread wherein any colored man of God is suspect. He wrote that 2 preachers from a nearby plantation were taken and never returned, their names left blank in every ledger that survives. Even the white citizens felt the tremor of fear. Merchants closed their stores early, church bells rang not for worship but for warning. In Austin, a special session of the county court debated a curfew for all free black residents, fearing the spread of seditious doctrine. Planters armed their sons and posted guards through the night, the memory of Caleb's vanished figure haunting every creak of the floorboards. By the 3rd day after the killings, the Bend had become less a plantation than an armed camp. Militia tents dotted the fields where cotton once stood, and the smell of horse sweat and gunpowder mixed with the damp sweetness of rotting bowls. Officially, the troops were there to restore order, but surviving letters from merchants in Austin reveal their true purpose: to exact an example so stern no other Negro shall think to imitate the preacher. Patrols fanned out for miles, riding into ravines and pine thickets in search of Caleb or anyone who might have aided him. They returned again and again empty-handed, their frustration bleeding into cruelty. Fragments of testimony taken decades later describe how suspects were tied to wagon wheels and questioned until unconscious, their names, if they ever gave them, lost to the wind. A single line in a militia ledger, its ink blurred by humidity, reads, "Several punished. No intelligence gained." It is both a confession and an evasion. In nearby Austin, a hurried inquest attempted to wrest a narrative from chaos. Court minutes from October 14 show pages of speculation but almost no evidence. Witnesses contradicted each other. Some claimed to have seen shadowed figures moving through the woods, others swore the deaths were the work of abolitionist agents. One judge demanded proof of a wider conspiracy, yet no confession ever surfaced. The record ends with the cryptic phrase, "Matter unresolved, files to be secured." Those files never re-emerged. Folklore holds that at least half a dozen enslaved men were hanged without trial in the weeks that followed, their graves unmarked somewhere along the Colorado River. Descendants still tell of certain low mounds in the cedar breaks where grass grows thin and birds keep an uneasy silence. These memories linger like smoke, impossible to confirm yet too persistent to dismiss. The white planter class, terrified by the breach of their authority, sought to erase the very memory of the event. Newspapers that had once hinted at a Negro preacher's vengeance quietly altered later editions, blaming bandits or Mexican marauders. County ledgers for 1847 show sudden gaps, missing pages, mismatched dates, whole sections scorched or crossed through. A fire in the Travis courthouse 2 years later conveniently destroyed more. Whether that blaze was accident or design remains an open question, but the effect was the same: silence where history should have spoken. Yet for all the efforts to bury the story, whispers of Caleb's night spread beyond Texas. Abolitionist papers in New York carried veiled references to the preacher who vanished into God's country, while letters among black congregations in New Orleans invoked his name in sermons about deliverance. Among the enslaved, his absence became a presence, a sign that even when records are burned and witnesses cowed, a single act of defiance can echo longer than any whip crack. By the first frost, the Bend was a scar on the landscape. Cotton lay unpicked, the big house stood abandoned, and militia patrols finally withdrew, muttering about the phantom preacher. Caleb himself remained a rumor. Some said he crossed into Mexico, others that he walked east under a new name and preached again. What mattered more was the fear he left behind, a lesson carved into every ledger and every nervous glance over a planter's shoulder. The official archives fall silent after that winter, offering only blackened edges where the story should be. But silence is itself a record, and the emptiness speaks of a night when the oppressed answered in a language their oppressors could neither predict nor erase, and of a preacher whose disappearance became the most potent testimony of all. By the spring of 1848, the Bend's field sprouted only weeds and rumor. Cotton that once fetched fortunes lay buried under silt, while the Travis County authorities turned their attention from vengeance to erasure. What began as an armed manhunt evolved into a quieter, more enduring campaign, a war on memory itself. The first blows fell on paper. According to an 1848 county expense ledger, one of the few administrative records to survive, funds were allocated for archival repairs after a mysterious courthouse fire. Yet surviving pages show a different truth. Entire dockets for late 1847 were already missing before the blaze, as if someone had removed them by hand. Marriage licenses from neighboring plantations appear intact, but the coroner's report for the 10 hanged overseers is conspicuously absent, replaced by a single line, "Filed elsewhere." No clerk ever clarified where elsewhere might be. Newspapers proved equally malleable. Early broadsides of the Austin Gazette describing unexplained killings on the Colorado were quietly revised in later printings to blame banditti from the frontier. Researchers in the 1930s uncovered 2 editions of the same November 1847 issue, one with a column headlined "Negro Preacher Suspected," the other with that headline excised. The paper offered no explanation, and the typesetter's notes that might have explained the revision have vanished. What remains are ghost columns, faint impressions where letters once stood, a palimpsest of fear and deliberate forgetting. Church records were no safer. A ledger from the First Baptist congregation in Austin contains a blank space where the minutes for October 1847 should be. On the opposite page, a faint penciled note, later rubbed nearly illegible, reads, "No mention of the preacher." Whether the omission was protective or punitive is impossible to know, but the effect was the same: silence in the place of testimony. This quiet purge seeped into daily life. Surviving correspondence between plantation families shows a studied avoidance of the Bend affair. Wives wrote to sisters about weather, births, and Sunday sermons, but never about the autumn when neighbors were found hanging in their own fields. One planter's letter to a cousin in Louisiana contains the cryptic line, "The less said of the Bend, the better for all," as if the very name could summon retribution or inspire imitation. Among the enslaved and the free black communities, the suppression was more insidious. Patrols raided clandestine prayer meetings, forbidding hymns that spoke of exodus or judgment. A Travis County ordinance of 1848 banned assembly after sundown for religious or other purposes, a measure clearly aimed at gatherings like those Caleb once led. A century later, elders interviewed by the Works Progress Administration recalled that their grandparents sang soft or not at all, fearing that even a whispered spiritual might be mistaken for a call to rebellion. Folklore, however, proved harder to silence. Across the piney woods and river bottoms, stories of the phantom preacher traveled along grapevine telegraphs, those hidden networks of word and song. Children were hushed with warnings, "Sleep or the night rider will take you," a phrase that to white ears sounded like a ghost tale but to black families carried a charge of pride. In some versions, Caleb never killed at all. The overseers, they said, were struck down by the hand of God, their nooses woven from their own sins. In others, he still roamed the hills disguised as a traveling minister, delivering sermons that ended with the whisper, "Freedom has many doors." Every retelling shifted the details, yet the core endured. A man who would not bow, a night when the lash was answered in kind, and a disappearance that denied his enemies the spectacle of a body. As one WPA informant put it in 1937, they couldn't catch him, so they tried to catch the story. But stories don't bleed. Today the official archives remain threadbare. Court ledgers from 1847 are blackened at the edges, militia rosters trail off mid-sentence, and the few surviving letters are scattered in private collections, some deliberately mislabeled as miscellaneous. Scholars searching for Caleb encounter more gaps than facts, more ashes than ink. Yet the very absence is its own testimony, a map of intentional forgetting. And still, beneath the layers of silence, the night of October 9, 1847, glows like a coal that will not die. In the cedar breaks where unmarked graves are rumored to lie, the soil yields old iron nails and fragments of rope after heavy rains. The Colorado River, once the witness to a preacher's exodus, still carries silt from those fields downstream, mingling history with every current. The record keepers believed they could smother the truth with missing pages and altered headlines. But absence is a witness too. Each burned ledger and empty column whispers the same indictment. Something happened here that power feared to name. And in that silence, Caleb's story lingers, an echo stronger than any verdict, a hymn beyond erasure, waiting for anyone willing to listen past the static of history. Long after the ledgers turned to ash and the courthouse walls cooled from fire, Caleb's name moved in a different way, soft and smoky, like a hymn carried on a night breeze. Among the black families of Central Texas, his story became a living ember passed from ear to ear, braided into prayers and hidden in lullabies. It was never told the same way twice, because survival demanded disguise, but each version carried the pulse of defiance. In the quarters along the Brazos and Colorado rivers, elders told children that a preacher once walked through cotton rows so quietly the dogs could not scent him. They said he spoke with a voice low as river mud, a tone that made overseers' whips tremble. Some called him Brother Caleb of the Midnight Gospel, claiming he could vanish like smoke when patrol riders drew near. Others swore he wore a coat of many patches, each square a piece of cloth from someone he'd saved, so that even the moon couldn't recognize him. A few whispered that he never left the bend at all, but became a heron who kept watch over the river, white as bone against the dusk. These stories flourished because the official records were silent. What paper refused to hold, memory carried like a hidden seed. A WPA interview from the 1930s with an elderly woman named Aunt Milla captures one fragment. "My grandmammy tell me the preacher hung 10 men, 'cause they hung his people every day with work and whip. Said the Lord himself cut him loose into the night." Her words, scratched onto a brittle transcript by a federal clerk, are the closest thing to an oral affidavit we possess. A reminder that while the courts erased him, the community could not. Music bore the legend as well. Field hollers and spirituals carried coded lines that plantation owners mistook for biblical lament but which listeners knew as tribute. In one variant of "Wade in the Water," singers added a stanza, "Go down, Caleb, go down, bind them with the Lord's own crown." Scholars tracing the hymn's migration have found that extra verse surfacing in black churches from Texas to Arkansas, often sung softly during communion, as if to keep its dangerous meaning alive yet hidden. Folklore even slipped into the narratives of those who feared him. White settlers along the lower Colorado told of a shadow preacher, who cursed the land, leaving crops to blight and wells to dry. Parents warned children that if they disobeyed, Caleb will ride the river fog and fetch you to judgment. Their terror, like the community's pride, ensured that his name was never entirely lost. Over time the preacher's legend bled into other tales of resistance. In some counties he became kin to Nat Turner, his Texas midnight vigil seen as a southern echo of that Virginia rebellion. In others he merged with the haint stories of runaway slaves who returned as spirits to avenge the dead. The precise details mattered less than the heartbeat beneath them, a memory of a man who struck back, who refused the role of victim, and who disappeared into mystery rather than a hangman's rope. To this day, descendants gather at unmarked spots along the river where the bend once stood. They bring offerings of river stones or carved wooden crosses, singing low spirituals that mention no names yet carry a heavy, familiar cadence. Some insist the night air there feels different, thicker, charged, as if the land itself remembers. In these gatherings the silence is not empty. It is reverent, heavy with the recognition that a story suppressed by law can survive in song, prayer, and the careful pauses between words. The record keepers may have burned their pages, but the people kept the fire, and each retelling is an act of quiet defiance, a refusal to let Caleb be folded into the dust of forgotten crimes. Thus, the preacher of the bend lives on, not in neat columns of ink but in the living current of voice and memory, a presence felt in the rustle of river reeds, in the rise of a hymn's last note, and in every whispered reminder that justice, once called, can never be fully silenced. Caleb's story, half legend, half ash in the archives, does not stand in solitary defiance. Across the American South of the 19th century, a quiet constellation of uprisings and shadowed reprisals glimmered behind the plantation facade, each a fragment of a greater pattern of resistance that white authorities tried desperately to scatter and forget. Historians who sift through fragile census rolls and fugitive slave notices can trace the outlines of this hidden network. In Virginia, 16 years before Caleb vanished into the Texas night, Nat Turner led a rising that left 55 whites dead and an entire region quaking. In the swampy parishes of Louisiana during the 1830s and 40s, poisonings of slave owners and overseers appeared so frequently in court dockets that newspapers coined the phrase, the arsenic panic. In South Carolina's Low Country, whispered plans for insurrection prompted mass arrests in 1844, just 3 years before the Bend killings, while in the rice fields of coastal Georgia, entire crews disappeared into marshes, never to return to their chains. Many of these revolts were small and soon forgotten, buried under the language of accident or illness in plantation ledgers. A runaway cook blamed for a master's sudden death might be recorded merely as absconded with suspicion of theft, her final act of resistance sanitized into petty crime. Yet the similarities are unmistakable: a beating or a family separation that lit the fuse, a moment of sudden violence, and then the telltale gaps in records: missing church minutes, lost court files, newspapers hastily reprinted with corrections. Caleb's Texas stands at the far western edge of this geography of defiance, but his methods echo those of rebels 1,000 miles away. Like the maroon communities of the Great Dismal Swamp, he relied on landscape as shield and partner, knowing the bends of the Colorado the way swamp fugitives knew every cypress knee and hidden inlet. Like the clandestine preachers of the Carolina Piedmont, he turned scripture into strategy, transforming biblical judgment into a weapon sharper than any blade. And like the poisoners of Louisiana, he wielded surprise as his greatest force, an act so sudden and total that it left the oppressor stunned, unsure which way to strike back. Suppressed newspapers from Texas hint that planters feared exactly this contagion of example. In an 1848 letter to the Houston Telegraph, a Travis County landowner wrote of the danger of a traveling gospel of insurrection, warning that black exhorters may carry secret embers from county to county. Another broadside from the same year, later found pasted inside the cover of a church hymnal, urged planters to guard the pulpits and silence any colored preacher whose doctrine is not supervised by a white elder. These frantic measures reveal the dread that Caleb's story might inspire others long after his body slipped beyond their grasp. Even within the clandestine oral tradition, his name joined a larger chorus. Folktales of the 10 hanged overseers crossed state lines, sometimes merging with older memories. In Arkansas, a version spoke of a preacher called the Deliverer, while in the Indian Territory a Choctaw elder recounted to missionaries a tale of a dark prophet who hung the cruel and vanished in the wind. These echoes show how resistance traveled without maps, stitched together by song, rumor, and the common rhythm of survival. Modern scholars argue that what plantation owners labeled isolated incidents were in fact a slow, unbroken war, a continuous struggle for autonomy waged in fields, kitchens, and clandestine meetings beneath the stars. Caleb's defiance was not an aberration, it was a stanza in a long, unwritten hymn of rebellion. His victory, however brief, stood as proof that the enslaved were neither passive nor resigned but fully human, capable of planning, of fury, of hope sharpened into action. Look closely at the silences of the archives and the pattern glints through. Where a courthouse fire erased records in Texas, a flood conveniently destroyed them in Mississippi. Where a preacher's name vanished from Baptist rolls, another preacher's signature stops mid-ink in Louisiana. Each absence is a scar pointing to presence, a collective, unacknowledged resistance that no statute or suppression could fully erase. So when we speak of Caleb, we do not speak of one man alone. We invoke an entire hidden nation of the enslaved who, in whispers and sudden storms of violence, defied the system that sought to own them. He was a flare in the dark, yes, but also one among many sparks that set fear alight in the heart of American slavery, a truth that still flickers beneath every gap in the historical record, daring us to read between the scorched lines and see the fire that once burned there. The Colorado River bends slow and silent through Travis County now, a ribbon of silt-brown water carrying the weight of a century and a half of forgetting. Stand on its banks at dusk and you will hear nothing of the screams or the hymns, only cicadas pulsing in the cedar dusk. Yet the land remembers. After a hard rain, the soil still exhales iron and ash, and fragments of hand-wrought nails work their way to the surface like bones seeking air. In the years after 1847, planters fenced the Bend's ruined acreage and tried to pretend nothing had happened. A deed filed in 1851 refers to the tract as vacant bottom number 7, stripped even of a name as if anonymity could cleanse the earth. Cotton eventually returned, but never with the same yield, and white neighbors whispered that the ground was restless, a place where tools broke and plows snagged on roots that were not there. A surveyor's notebook from 1860 records unusual sinkage along the riverbank, an engineer's phrase that locals translated as the preacher's curse. When emancipation came in 1865, formerly enslaved families who had heard of Caleb's nighttime justice began drifting back to the region. They built small cabins and planted gardens near the unmarked fields, not to farm cotton but to keep watch. Freedmen's Bureau agents wrote of colored squatters living on the Old Bend, their presence a quiet insistence that some stories must stay rooted. They carried no written proof, only memory, an inheritance of song and whisper that no court could challenge. Meanwhile, white authorities labored to smother the past beneath layers of new order. County commissioners sold parcels to railroad speculators, renaming creeks and crossroads so that old maps became useless. A Baptist congregation raised a clapboard church on the very site of the overseer's deaths, preaching reconciliation while leaving the foundation stones unmarked. Yet even that church could not keep silence absolute. In its earliest communion books, now faded to the color of dried tobacco, a faint penciled notation survives beside an 1872 entry, "Watch night kept as in the days of Caleb." The minister's hand trembled or perhaps hurried, for the graphite trails off mid-stroke, but the meaning remains. The story lingered, impossible to exorcise. By the turn of the 20th century, journalists chasing lost Texas legends occasionally heard rumors of a preacher who hanged 10 men and vanished. A 1907 column in the Houston Chronicle mentions a tale so dark the county elders still lower their voices, but offers no details, claiming that records were destroyed in an old courthouse fire of uncertain date. Readers might have taken it for frontier fancy, a ghost yarn to fill column inches, yet those who had inherited the true account knew better. Families who claimed kinship to Caleb met quietly on the riverbanks each October, leaving offerings of river stones wrapped in cloth. They sang the old spirituals in minor keys, the same hymns he was said to have preached beneath the cypress trees. A WPA interviewer in 1937 recorded the recollection of Mary Eliza Moore, then 94. "My granddaddy say the preacher still walks that river. He say freedom don't die, it just waits." Her words, scrawled in pencil on government stationery, read less like folklore than a vow. The decades that followed only deepened the mystery. Roads shifted, property lines blurred, and the bend slid off modern maps. But hunters still speak of a low mist rising from the Colorado on autumn nights, shaped, they say, like a tall man with a preacher's hat. Geologists dismiss it as ordinary river fog. The elders who know the song simply nod and smile, as if the land itself still carries a sermon no science can chart. The Great Depression brought new excavators of memory. Federal Writers Project interviewers arrived with notepads and typewriters, eager to capture the vanishing voices of the last generation born in bondage. They asked about cotton prices and church picnics, but the elders, sensing rare ears that might listen, offered something deeper. In transcript after transcript, a name surfaced in quiet italics, Caleb, each time spelled a little differently as though the sound mattered more than the letters. "Cal," said one. "Caleb," murmured another. The variations were not mistakes. They were shields, a way of keeping the preacher free from the cages of spelling and history alike. Some accounts carried eerie precision. One man swore that his grandmother had hidden in a pine thicket on the night of October 9, 1847, and heard 10 ropes singing in the wind. Another recalled an heirloom Bible with a page torn clean where a family genealogy should have been. "My papa said that page burned itself," he told the interviewer, "so the sheriff couldn't burn it for us." Whether literal or poetic, these testimonies stitched a single message. The story could not be erased because it no longer belonged to paper. It lived in marrow. The state of Texas, however, maintained its posture of absence. The 1936 Centennial Exhibition celebrated Alamo heroes and cattle barons, but nowhere in the vast halls of Dallas was there mention of a slave preacher who hanged 10 white men. Official guides presented a vision of Texas forged by rugged pioneers and benevolent planters, a myth polished to hide the scars of bondage. Even as the WPA recorded fragments of Caleb's legend, government archivists quietly filed them under headings like local superstition or folk belief, Negro, burying living history under the soft soil of folklore. Yet folklore proved the stronger archive. Through the civil rights era, Caleb's name resurfaced in protest chants and church sermons across the South. Black student groups in Austin whispered of a midnight pastor, when planning sit-ins, a private code for righteous rebellion. In the 1970s, a blues musician from Bastrop recorded a song called 10 Lines of Rope, its lyrics cloaked in biblical imagery but unmistakable to those who knew the river's secret. Each generation found its own way to lift the story, not as relic but as rallying cry. Today, the physical landscape bears almost no official marker. A county park sign lists fishing rules and boat launch hours, but nothing about the October night when 10 overseers swung from their own gallows. Still, visitors speak of an odd quiet near the old bend, a hush that deepens after sunset. Local anglers tell of feeling watched, of hearing low murmurs that rise and fade with the current. Geographers call it acoustic illusion. Descendants call it remembrance. To walk there at twilight is to feel the tension of two histories, the sanctioned version of Texas, wide skies, cattle trails, freedom myths, and the underground chronicle etched by Caleb's act of defiance. The official silence becomes its own monument, a blank stone that forces the listener to lean closer, to imagine the sound of ropes creaking in a cold October wind. Perhaps that is the preacher's final sermon, that some truths must live outside the record, moving instead through bloodlines, songlines, and the restless earth. The courthouse fires could burn paper. Editors could whitewash headlines. But the Colorado keeps its slow vigil, carrying silt and rumor downstream, whispering to those who care to hear. The river runs quiet now, but the silence is deceptive. Beneath the slow churn of the Colorado, the story of Caleb, the slave preacher who defied an empire, moves like an undertow, unseen but impossible to still. He left no grave for pilgrims, no etched headstone for historians, only the riddle of 10 overseers found swinging in the Texas dawn and a trail of scorched paper where the record should be. Walk the old bend at dusk and you can feel it, a pressure in the air as if the earth itself carries an unspent word. Cotton no longer grows there with any abundance, and locals still speak of plow blades snapping on roots that are not roots, of sudden fog rising in moonlight thick enough to swallow a lantern's glow. Scientists call it groundwater vapor. The elders of the black communities who keep the songs know better. They call it the preacher's breath. Caleb's act was never just one man's fury. It was a shard of a larger, hidden rebellion that stretched across plantations, swamps, and centuries, a truth stitched together from whispers and omissions, from the gaps between burned courthouse files and the hymns sung low in brush arbors. His disappearance denied the oppressor the spectacle of his death and gifted the oppressed a story of triumph unbound by chains. In that single night, he claimed the one freedom the system could not contain, the freedom to define his own ending. Generation after generation, voices tried to smother him. Sheriffs filed blank dockets, editors struck lines of type, preachers thundered sermons of obedience. Yet the preacher remains, not as a ghost but as a living question. What happens when the enslaved write their own scripture in rope and fire? He is a challenge to every sanitized textbook, a shadow cast across every plantation tour that lingers on silverware and neglects the whip. You may stand at that river bend and hear nothing more than the wind through reeds. But listen closer. The current carries fragments of hymn and heartbeat, the sound of a congregation that refused to die. It is the echo of those who bent their backs under cotton sacks by day and sang freedom into the night. The echo of a preacher who taught that judgment can wear human hands. This is the story they tried to erase. But absence is not silence, and silence is not consent. Caleb's defiance, buried in folklore and scattered through forgotten ledgers, is a lantern passed hand to hand, waiting for those willing to strike a spark. His sermon is unfinished, and the next verse belongs to us. If your family keeps an old Bible with a name scratched away, if you've heard whispers of a night when the river sang of justice, add your memory below. Every comment is a breath against the darkness, every shared fragment another page rescued from the fire. Subscribe, speak, and help carry this hymn forward, because the preacher of the bend is still walking, and the story is not done until we tell it together.